nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim. Think about how difficult it is for sissy boys, or how difficult it is for tomboys to function socially without being bullied, or without being teased, or without sometimes suffering threats of violence, or without their parents intervening to say, maybe you need a psychiatrist, or why can't you be normal? So, there are institutional powers, like psychiatric normalization, and there are informal kinds of practices like bullying, which try to keep us in our gendered place. There's a real question for me about how such gender norms get established and policed, and what the best way is to disrupt them and to overcome the police function. It's my view that gender is culturally formed, but it's also a domain of agency or freedom. It's most important to resist the violence that is imposed by ideal gender norms, especially against those who are gender different, who are non-conforming in their gender presentation.
Okay, so here is Butler for us. I think she's an amazing talker, amazing speaker. So Butler uses this theory of performative utterances that John Austin came out with to suggest that our gestures, our statements, the way we behave and conduct ourselves are performative. Not in the sense that this is a performance that we pull upon the world, pretending to be someone, or someone else who we are not, or someone who we are, in fact, but in the sense that they present us, they kind of, these performatives present us, our gestures, the way we speak and so on, present us as gendered in a certain way to the world. We actively constitute our gendered identity through being performative at every second of our existence. So yeah, I'm gonna ask people what they think about it, my students, and I would also love to ask you what you think about it. What attracts your attention in this video? Is there anything you want to comment on? Butler is leaning on Foucault in her analysis of how things are being constructed in our discursive practices. The way we conceive, talk, and think of things produces them, particularly when it comes to things that have social dimension. She says, Foucault points out that juridical system of power produce the subjects they subsequently come to represent. The regulation of these subjects, for example, a criminal, right, a figure of a criminal, is done, as she says, through the limitation, prohibition, regulation, control, and even protection of individuals, right? Same goes to refugees, for example. We construct a juridical subject by regulating bodies. The USA, for example, sorts out the immigrants into many categories, each of which enters a specific set of relationships with the state, legal and illegal immigrants, asylum seekers, people who use national waiver because they are considered an asset because of their superior skills and so on. The existence of these figures depends on how they are being talked about in spoken and written language of regulations. Because you really, for example, you don't know who is going to be an asset for the nation. Maybe this is the illegal immigrant who is going to be an asset, you know? Sorry, but we don't know about it. We don't speak about them in this language. We're constructing them as this figure of danger, you know, that presents a veritable threat to society. And this is why we want to get rid of them, you know, for example. And here is where Butler reminds us that the juridical formation of language and politics that represent women as the subject of feminism is itself a discursive formation, an effect of a given version of representational politics. And the feminist subject turns out to be discursively constructed by the very political system that is supposed to facilitate its emancipation. This is basically the discipline and punish, Foucault. Right? There are the sets of regulations, sets of prohibitions, sets of limitations that construct the subject discursively. So feminism presents us with the figure of women needing liberation or emancipation. And this is what repels a lot of women, because not only does one need to affirm one's own existence as a woman in this framework, which, you know, we don't want to do, frankly, you know. Even Zizek says that as much as I am masculine, every time I have to kind of go to the restroom, I have to sort myself along the gender divide, and I don't like it, you know. And if you are forced to time and again reaffirm your existence as a woman, which is a second-class citizen, basically, you don't want to do that, you know. But only you have to do this, but also you need to imagine yourself as a subject in need of some help by liberation or emancipation. And a lot of women feel like this is humiliating. You know, among my Russian interlocutors, particularly in some sense because the gender discourse was different in the USSR. For example, there were no highly gendered images of a suburban wife in the 50s and the 60s, like a lawful embodiment of femininity. These images were absent. Our national imagination was not fed by those, you know, unlike American imagination. Many women do not feel a particular pressure of being a woman, or they think they don't. I mean, I would say I was very radical in terms of if you don't want to embrace it, it means you are in denial, and this is internalized misogyny, you know, in a way. But you kind of have to give it credit as well. This is the feeling that people don't want to embrace. You cannot force them to embrace this feeling. So getting on board with the feminist agenda feels to these women like a difficult task, because they first have to gender themselves appropriately. They have to say, we are the feminist subject, you know, we are in need of liberation and emancipation. They have to embrace their own femininity, of themselves being women, whatever that means, before subscribing to this agenda in any rendition. So, juridical power inevitably produces what it claims to merely represent. Women in general, feminists in particular, is not some objectively given category met in the wild, in nature, but rather they emerge as the subject of feminist, in this case, politics, as a result of this organized discourse. That is not to say that feminism is the only force that genders women in the contemporary society, or that the patriarchal ideas somehow offer women more freedom in regard to their self-identification. No. No. This is just to say that feminism is not somehow above and beyond critique, because it is itself a subject, it is itself subject to this process. that we find so compelling, namely the process of imagining women and categorizing them, theorizing about them, and coming up with new versions for what constitutes a woman. Women, even in the plural, as Butler says, has become a troublesome term, a site of contest, a cause for anxiety. Again, this didn't begin with feminism. One could argue that women always have been a troublesome term and a cause for anxiety. And the reason for it is because how we imagine women in a lot of ways constitutes how we imagine the human being and what is human being. This is the essential anthropological question of every philosophy. You know that philosophy has anthropological dimension. Or you could equally say that this is the philosophical foundation of anthropology. What is the human? How is it human? We are not just surveying the field of problems related to different cultures, admiring the diversity. We are seeking to understand what makes a human. But women does not denote a common identity, as Butler implies, right? For two reasons. First, a woman is not an exhaustive term. Not only one is a woman, but one is a lot of different identities. And the second reason flows from the first. Gender is not always constituted coherently or consistently in different historical contexts, as Butler says, right? And because gender intersects with racial, class, ethnic, sexual, and regional modalities of discursively constructed identities. Here is where intersectionality comes, and intersectionality accounts or tries to account for the intersection of this axis. Gender is produced and maintained at the site of political and cultural intersections. Butler is identifying this difficulty in the emergent and developing feminism, that it assumes that there is a universal basis for feminism, that women is something that exists in all cultures, and it's a consistent reality of being. We kind of observe this assumption blowing in full force. This universal basis is that there is an identity assumed to exist cross-culturally. This is the identity of women. And the woman is conceived, the women are conceived as oppressed, and the idea of the cross-culturally existing identity often accompanies the notion that the oppression of women has some singular form discernible in the universal or hegemonic structure of patriarchy or masculine domination. End of quote. Here is where our question with which we started comes in handy. In what sense our cultural assumptions are peculiar versus in what sense they're universal? And if we assume the same form of hegemonic structure existing all over the world, then we are likely to begin saving women, quote unquote, from patriarchal dominance in their own countries. Anthropologist Lila Abu-Laghod has the piece titled "Do Muslim Women Need Saving?", examining our cultural assumptions that allow Western feminists to direct Muslim women to get rid of their hijabs and burqas because they're the symbol of oppression. And Abu-Laghod asks, but do we not know in which attire we should attend the theater? This is just what is right in this culture. This is what people wear. We don't wear theater attire to the beach and vice versa. So why should we be so certain about what people in other cultures, particularly women, should wear to which places. Abu Laghod also elucidates the cultural meaning of hijab and burqa wearing practices. It turns out that women wear it by way of preserving their privacy by means of using this portable form of private space. This is like a house moving in a public space. This is based on different understanding of where the division between the private and the public lies. The failure to account for cultural specificities of which we know little, or in any case not enough, leads to the usage of feminism as a racially charged ethnocentric tool that interferes without any consideration based on convictions that may be alien to the culture. This is where so-called white feminism comes into being. Not only does it cast a white woman as a paragon victim of oppression, but it also saves women of color from men of color. This is what is sometimes also called the white supremacy feminism. As Butler says, that form of feminist theorizing, the one that assumes the hegemonic self-same form of oppression across cultures, has come under criticism for its efforts to colonize inappropriate non-Western cultures to support highly Western notions of oppressions. And they tend as well to construct a third world, quote-unquote, or even an Orient, she says, in which gender oppression is subtly explained as symptomatic of an essential non-Western barbarism. So the assumption that the oppression is hegemonic and it has the same structure all over the world strengthens the feminism's claim to relevance and gives the veritability of the existence of women as constructed through being oppressed, right? So the women exist by virtue of being oppressed, essentially. So this quality of being oppressed becomes constitutive for the female gender. Now, Butler wrote this book in 1990, when the transgender discourse, it appears, based on this book, has not yet become the central arena of feminist constant argument, you know. At least this is what it seems like by reading this. For if it was, you know that there was a lot of talking regarding what it is exactly that makes a woman, and it turns out that there is literally nothing that could be said to be constitutive for being a woman. It's not genitalia or organs of reproduction like the womb, for example, because obviously a woman can have her womb surgically removed, and this will not mean that she ceased to be a woman. A woman may or may not have children. In the end, you know, she doesn't have to have a womb to be a woman, you know. May or may not have hormones associated with femaleness of her body, you know. May or may not have long hair or be feminine, whatever that means in its turn. May or may not be attracted to men or have penetrative sex. May or may not use she, her pronouns, speaking about herself. And none of it will necessarily be constitutive of her womanhood. That becomes even more complicated if we talk about the feminine and the masculine. First of all, the feminine emerges in connection and in opposition to the masculine. It's a binary that, first of all, doesn't even have the third member. It's either feminine or masculine always, right? There is no third possibility. Juridical structures engender, naturalize, and immobilize the category of identities, as Butler says. That means that there is little apart from these categories. They're immobile once you are caught in their relentless linguistic and social production. There is no way out until we start rejecting these categories. What Butler suggests we did is we underwent a radical rethinking, she says, of the ontological constructions of identity. Because there are other axes that constitute our identity aside from gender, such as class, race, ethnicity. We cannot rely on the feminine and the masculine binary. These axes, she says, make the singular notion of identity a misnomer. So perhaps the very idea of identity is misleading, for at some point we are that, and at some other point we are yet something completely different. Now, I'm a woman, and I'm a representative of the middle class, at least as far as globally it is conceived. And I am white, and also I am Russian. And not all of these things always go in accordance with one another. So singular identity is not necessarily the way we want to imagine our identity ontologically as that essence of our existence. Moreover, Butler asks, to what extent does the category of women achieve stability and coherence only in the context of heterosexual matrix? Yes, what if it is in the compulsory heterosexuality that we construct women as the subject of feminism, feminist politics in the first place? And as anthropologists, we know that things are different all over the world. There are other matrices but the ones that we got used to. For instance, the Nandi in Kenya have a tradition where women may become husbands of women. We still talk and think of them in a way that is highly gendered. Now I'm going to show you the video about the Nandini practice. Yeah, and I want to ask you what you notice about it, what jumps on you kind of out of this video, a short story, you know? What you notice about it.
So Magdalene Kesura Manieri has two wives. Indeed, Magdalene is a husband to them. And KTN's Mexican now brings us the story of an age-old Nandi cultural practice through a woman who says hers has been a happy 30 years of woman-to-woman marriage. Do not be fooled by her slow and frail strides. In the village, she walks in the capacity of a man. Gogo, as they call her, which is encouraging to mean grandmother, is married to two women, an Nandi cultural practice that allows a barren woman to marry another woman.
Daughter wa hii familia huyu akiwa mama na huyu ni gogo. Kwetu tunamuita gogo, hatumuiti baba, ngawaje kama tungesema ni baba.
One of the main reasons for female-to-female marriages among the Nandi community is to give the barren woman a chance to get children, a process referred to as Kilalmat, the willingness to procreate. Gogo Magdalene was married to the son of Koitalel Arab Samoe, the renowned Nandi leader who fought the colonialists. But aside from that, she had no other pride, so she used the opportunity provided by the cultural practice. Gogo married not one, but two wives, getting 12 children and 20 grandchildren.
Akubarikiwa kupata watoto. Na kwa kati ya wanani, ukikuwa umekoza watoto, at least mpaka watakupetu wanasema tu wanakuashia moto. Yani jawe yako ni kuwezesha uwe na watoto.
No sexual relation is allowed. The woman that Gogo marries gets a male suitor with whom they bear children, but the children belong to Gogo Magdalene. Gogo is the sole provider for the new family.
Maisha yetu ilikuwa nzuri, tulilelewa maisha mzuri, ya heshima, tulilishwa vizuri, tulisomeshwa.
The 95-year-old holds firmly the position of a man. The process allows her to attend initiation ceremonies that are exclusive to men. Attend baraza while being regarded as a man. At home, both wives live in harmony.
Now most of the families in York na baba unapata wengine wako na mafarikano nini. kupigana nini, kesi ya saa yote, lakini kwetu ilikuwa ni kama mama na msichana wake kuishi kwa boma.
Sasa mmeoa watu mbili na sisi tu tumekaa mzuri, hakuna shida yoyote.
The wives are expected to take good care of Gogo as she ages. Her sense of humor is clear. She believes it's a cultural practice that should have continuity with the current generation.
Sitakuwa bure. Hakuna mtoto, lakini watoto wangu sasa iko wanaume, iko ndito.
The cultural practice also allows the husband of the barren woman to marry another woman. Barren Kalenjin women were not divorced, but were instead allowed to marry after undergoing some rituals and after attaining menopause, and thereafter not allowed to sleep with any man, including her husband. Masika ndiye KTN, Uasin Gishu County.
Well, I'm sorry, there was a lot of things that were not translated. Unfortunately, I don't speak this language, so I cannot also translate them for you. But that was the best video that I found about the Nandi practice in Kenya. And, well, I will ask you, what do you think about it? What do you think? And I will tell you that if you are interested in the Nandi practice, you can read the piece by Regina Oboler titled "Is the Female Husband a Man? Woman-Woman Marriage Among the Nandi in Kenya," and you can find it in our library, for example. But it's an interesting piece, wrestling with our categories of men and women at the face of the situation where we suspect that these categories suddenly lose their applicability, right? But we want to reinstall them in a way. We are like, is the female husband a man? Should the man always be male, you know? If the woman is a wife, shouldn't we be calling her a female wife? And so on. And well, it depends on what you mean by any of that, but likely there are no obligations to human beings anyway, because it's very hard to build this wall of bricks between the feminine and the masculine, and the heterosexual matrix that reinforces this binary breaks every now and then. But what I find personally fascinating about that video is that the beginning fragment where the reporter says, "Do not be fooled by this crippled, you know, a person who is walking around. She is walking in the capacity of the man, you know." So this is kind of the revelation, you know, the unintended revelation of the gender ideas that are set so deeply in our mind that we don't even reflect on them. And here we are again on the subject familiar to us, the distinction between sex and gender. Butler says, originally intended, I mean, we talked about it already, originally intended to dispute the biology's destiny formulation, the distinction between sex and gender serves the argument that whatever biological interactability sex appears to have, gender is culturally constructed. Hence, gender is neither the causal result of sex nor as seemingly fixed as sex. Yeah, I mean, I told them about this cultural and social consensus according to which in the contemporary society sex and gender are different, and sex is biological and gender is social. This will remain a consensus for a long time because the public is only arriving collectively to this distinction. Yet already in 1990, Butler knew that this is not the universal solution to our problems. The problems of overdetermination regarding what is feminine and what is masculine and what hold they possess over human bodies. First of all, gender is often imagined as congruent to sex. Therefore, no matter the distinction, fundamentally the binary is still preserved. So either the idea of gender as the social, cultural meanings that the sexual body assumes, as Butler puts it, simply mimics the sex, doubling the binary, or alternatively, gender becomes a free-floating artifice that doesn't depend on sex at all. Gender itself becomes a free-floating artifice, she says, with the consequence that man and masculine might just as easily signify a female body as a male one, and women and feminine a male body as easily as a female one. Well, personally, I don't see a big problem here, but the point that Butler is making is that if gender becomes so unattached to sex as a category that we imagine it completely separate from sex, then it loses its meaning. It's just, a free-floating artifice. It becomes too arbitrary, and naturally there is no need in this case for female and male, for masculine and feminine to be exhaustive. Again, I personally do not register that as a big problem, but Butler suggests that by way of radically splitting sex and gender, we also lose the sense of the sex. She posits a series of questions here. What is sex anyway? Is it natural, anatomical, chromosomal, or hormonal? And how is a feminist critic to assess the scientific discourses which purport to establish facts for us? She takes facts in quotation marks, and I must say that if the scientific discourse purports to establish any facts, then it is too deeply invested in the categories that we have contemporary. Remember we talked about the limitations of our evolutionary developed sensory organs and the language that we are using. They present us with a set of limitations, and within these limitations the facts become heavily dependent on the interpretation. There is not a single fact that could be presented without any mediation in words or images. And when it comes to gender and sex, biological and evolutionary facts are always subject to doubt. A lot of things that we think we know, that we believe in, are but our conjectures. Yeah, we also talked about beliefs, which is something that we perceive to be true. But Butler does continue asking, does sex have a history? Does each have a different history or histories? A somewhat popular notion right now, right? And there is also no reason to suggest that there are only two sexes existing, right? There are intersex people, and often the objection to their existence, one couldn't put it any other way, is that they're a negligibly small number of population. But we talked about it when we were speaking about inductive and deductive reasoning. One example is enough to make a category. So, here's a story for you.
Raise your hands if you have testes. I'm Pigeon. I'm Alice.
I'm Emily.
I'm Cypher.
And we are intersexy.
Intersex describes a person who doesn't fit the typical definition of male or female.
I have XY chromosomes, but typical female genitalia.
I'm a girl who has testes and XY chromosomes.
I identify as a queer, gender non-conforming intersex person.
I identify as a black intersex man.
Intersex is not new. It's been around since the beginning of human existence. I mean, there's probably even intersex dinosaurs, if you think about it.
Transgender has to deal with your gender identity, whereas intersex has to deal with your biological characteristics.
Often, intersex people get surgeries that they don't want, and transgender people have to fight for surgeries that they do want. They gave my mom the excuse that the internal testes were cancerous, that I would develop cancer.
They didn't even come up with an excuse, basically, in terms of a health-related reason. They instead just said it was about the appearance.
A lot of doctors are very uncomfortable with the idea that I have testes, and they're still trying to get them removed, but I'm perfectly healthy and there's nothing wrong with them.
They did a surgery to remove my testes and told my parents to take me home and just raise me as a girl, and I didn't find out about it myself until I was 12.
They're aren't a lot of options, or medical providers don't explore other options. My mom would put me in dresses, and she would be like, "Oh, aren't you so cute and you're so pretty?" And I would be like, "Yeah, it's horrible." I was put on hormonal treatment, which consisted of estrogen and progesterone. I just wanted to belong. I wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be different. So even though I knew something felt amiss, I conformed. He was very condescending. He was like, "You intersex activists don't know what you're talking about."
It's difficult for intersex people to find each other because from an early age we're told not to talk about our bodies.
I didn't feel like I was the only one.
My doctors always told me there was nobody else like me, and so it just perpetuates a vicious cycle of shame and stigma that we can't break out of. I would tell another intersex person that you are worthy, you are lovable.
Your body is beautiful. You're beautiful.
Intersex people don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with them.
I know you feel like you might not be able to get through this. I know you might have really dark thoughts, but I want you to know that meeting other intersex people and finding a community or a support group can be one of the most important aspects in your healing process. And we're out there. We're out here. We're here. And I just hope you can find us.
So there's actually a number of videos featuring the intersex advocate since Saifa Wall, including the one that details the contact with the doctor years after the surgery has been performed. And the doctor indeed is repeating that this is the decision that they made back in the day based on all the available information, and that had he had the opportunity to do it again, he would do the same things exactly the same way. Which I think I understand the defiance, but when you are confronted by someone whose life was unnecessarily transformed and harmed by this unneeded surgery, this is not the response that you want to put forward. What do you think about this video? What caught your attention? Is there anything you want to comment on or notice about it? These are the questions that I'm going to ask my students. You're also very welcome to comment. So because this discourse of sex is still produced within the language, and it is produced by various political institutions, we have to suspect that, as we discussed before in this class, as Butler puts it, perhaps the construct called sex is as culturally constructed as gender. It would make no sense then to define gender as the structural interpretation of sex if sex itself is a gendered category. And indeed, what can you say of sex that will not be already gendered? If we use pretty much the same words to describe sex as we use to describe gender, then how do we separate sex from gender? But by what means could this distinction be accomplished? Gender ought not to be conceived, Butler says, merely as the cultural inscription of meaning on a pre-given sex, juridical conception. Gender must also designate the very apparatus of production whereby the sexes themselves are established. It is through gender and gendered vocabulary and distinctions that we establish sex and the differences between sex. For us to say that sex is biological when we are talking about it in language and we are using the socially developed constructs for talking about it, what does it mean, sex is biological? Sex is no more reachable by the thought as the soul in the body and soul distinction in the Platonic Western tradition. It always remains this elusive realm of which we presuppose that such and such things are true, but when we begin unpacking them, we realize that we are still within the domain of gender. Furthermore, what does it mean to say that gender itself is constructed? If gender is constructed, Butler says, could it be constructed differently, or does it constructedness imply some form of social determinism foreclosing the possibility of agency and transformation? Who is constructing gender, exactly, and how? And if gender is already constructed as such, it either means that it is arbitrary, at least to a certain degree, and it always has a possibility to be deconstructed, or, as Butler offers, it could mean that gender is in fact constructed in culture by such powerful forces that they take upon themselves a role of cultural laws, and in this case, biology is destiny, flips and becomes culture is destiny. That is to say, despite our attempts to separate biological and social, distinguish between sex and gender, these two things collapse, time and again collapse into one another. Judith Butler goes on to analyze several feminist theorists in their construction of women and the feminine. She compares and contrasts views of Beauvoir, I have to train myself, and Irigaray. These are the French thinkers, influential social theorists. De Beauvoir lived in 1908-1986. Irigaray was born in 1933. These thinkers are from slightly different generations, but not as different, right? Come to think of it, there is only 20-something difference of birth between them. From the historical point of view, it's little. So as Butler says, Beauvoir is clear that one becomes a woman, but always under a cultural compulsion to become one. If this is so, then this is an act of becoming that never stops and is never complete. One does not become a woman, but is becoming, therefore one is never woman enough. In some sense, becoming never reaches its destination. Becoming is impossible to fulfill, for it is always directed at an unachievable goal, and things separate one from inhabiting womanhood fully. On the most primitive level in the contemporary culture, a woman becomes a woman through a man. That is to say, she is not predicated on herself, but she receives her identity through a man. The hegemonic cultural discourse supposes that there are intractable borders and limits. Borders of analysis, Butler says, suggest the limits of a discursively conditioned experience. So, there is no way out beyond this conditioned experience because a hegemonic cultural discourse is predicated on binary structures that appear as the language of universal rationality. The language of universal rationality, as we just saw in the video of the Nandi in Kenya on female husbands, right? We still want to sort things out, defining, is she a man? And in what sense she is a man? But we also know that she is a woman and our consciousness just struggles to place her. That's because we are within this framework of our thinking, taking our language as the language of universal rationality, taking the peculiarities of our culture as universal. Some things you can observe, same things you can observe in transgender discourse. For example, even in comments on social media to transgender individuals, the same people who deny the female gender to transgender women will nonetheless gender them as they would cisgender women, right? Cisgender, as you know, is the term denoting the condition when the gender, as now it's popular to put, assigned to the individual at birth, coincides with the gender that the person identifies herself with. So this is kind of a self-defeating practice of denying a transgender woman her gender, but gendering her accordingly at the same time. like she doesn't know what she's talking about, for example, or something like that. Sex for Beauvoir in Butler's rendition could not qualify as a prediscursive anatomical facticity. A body has always already been interpreted by cultural meanings. The body is never free from gender and the load of cultural assumptions that come with it. Bodies cannot be said, she says, to have a signifiable existence prior the mark of their gender. In Beauvoir's terms, the feminine gender is marked. The universal person and the masculine gender are conflated, thereby defining women in terms of their sex and extolling men as the bearers of a body transcendent universal personhood. End of quote. And for Irigaray, in Irigaray's terms, women are the sex which is not one. Within a language that rests on univocal signification, the female sex constitutes the unrepresentable, the unconstrainable, and the undesignatable. Well, phallogocentrism is the term by Derrida. It refers to the linguistic condition we find ourselves in when the field of language is constructed in a way that privileges phallus, right? The difference between the views of Beauvoir and Irigaray, as far at least as Butler has it, is that for Beauvoir, women are the negative term of men, the lack against which masculine identity differentiates itself, and for Irigaray this is not the question of lack that much, as it is the question of the impossibility to represent the female within the phallogocentric language structures that define our existence and experience socially. The woman is not the man's other, nor she is the lack, but simply eludes the very requirement of representation. Okay, well, I plan to ask them several questions, but I might run out of time. There is a slide of definitions of gender that I picked from Butler, but I might not have time for that. The next week is titled Performance of Queer Self, and we are watching a film in class, Paris is Burning, by director Jenny Livingston. I'll kind of take them on board. The film is shorter than the class, so I will provide them with a short introduction to this film. And the questions we are going to think and talk about are some of the questions we were having this week and some new questions. The new questions are: how queer is queer desire? How does a queer self exist in the world of compulsive heterosexuality, and what expressions does it take? How do humans limit the totalizing power of gender in their performance of self? Those are the questions. And yeah, so the assumption here is that gender is a totalizing force that possesses the power to dictate our self-expression to the extent we don't always like. If you feel comfortable within your gender, this is fine, but as an anthropologist, as a scholar of culture, you want to approximate the existence of others as much as you can. On the other hand, people who who take this queer identity, they are more enlightened than the rest of us regarding this identity, because they inhabit it, and most people don't. And they are especially attuned to the complexities of this discourse. In the sense, it's kind of a challenge to talk about queer identities, but I feel like we need to do it. And even if there will be mistakes made, it's still better than not to talk about it. Yeah, so regardless of what positionality we inhabit, I still think that the exposure to Jenny Livingston's work is going to be useful for us to further trouble our assumptions regarding gender and the performativity qualities of gender, and I will provide the broader context by quoting some of your critics, because she also was critiqued. It's kind of always a never-ending discourse, a never-ending conversation, and there is always a room for it to be more precise. So I might actually try and train myself further, and give the new live video next week. So I'm trying to read the questions now. This sounds like it will be a comprehensive and well-rounded discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you. I wish I could be in this class. Wow, that's very kind of you. Sort of gives everyone a chance. I don't know what does that mean. Gives anyone a chance, everyone a chance. It's already out of context. I don't really know what it says, but thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for listening, and thank you for participating. It's a challenge for me to read these lectures. This is partly why I am giving this training round, because I know most of my colleagues don't. And one of the reasons that they don't is because that's their native language, and that's not my native language. So I have to train myself. So thank you so much for being with me and giving me your amazing feedback, and hopefully I will see you next week then.